לא עשתה לי בעלון כתוב.
Also get past on the top.
Preparation for the red.
You haven't helped for years.
Dr. Feldman.
Not enough.
Here, take the charge.
For all your patients, me included. For all your patients, me included.
Go through.
No, gider. Kaçta gidecek? Gel. Die kann genug. Geht, ne?
Kom eens op naar het worden.
All your patients, me included.
This is the guardian angels that help us out in the area now.
God Almighty bless you.
Thank you very much.
Through your strength, all the people are stronger.
Thank you very much.
God Almighty bless you to use in a good way, in a quiet way.
Thank you very much.
Have good news.
Thank you.
That's one of your co-workers. That's the gospel you also. Also come out.
This is the charity that the rabbi gives.
God Almighty bless you. Good news. Not success.
This is the charity. You give us the charity. Hauptstadt. This is it for the guardian angels. This is the charity.
God Almighty bless you.
Take this for charity.
God Almighty bless you. God Almighty bless you. Huh? No.
Everything you do.
Give to charity.
Yeah, I heard.
Thank you very much.
My birthday is Lamed Kislev this week.
That's the birthday, the happy year.
Zit daar voor op de hand. Goed zo.
L'chaim, Neshama Moshe ben Michal, my dear Shver, the Rebbe's doctor, Neshama Shaman Aliyah, be a good Tibet for all of us. And let's hope before the Shloishim is over, we're reunited with my Shver and my Shviger, with the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin, the coming of Mashiach Amen, L'chaim. Thank you on behalf of the family, the Feldman family, for coming tonight for the Shloishim. I'll ask everybody to please turn off your phones. We'll hear about my father-in-law. I know you've heard already a lot about him. My name is Levi Shemtov, married to Sarah. But actually, when the Rebbe called for me to say L'chaim, the Shabbos after our Sheva Brachos, Shabbos after our Chasana, the Rebbe didn't ask Rabbi Groner to call Levi Shemtov. The Rebbe asked Rabbi Groner, who is Dr. Feldman's Adam? So that's my official title. I'm very proud to have that title. And I hope that all of us, as children and grandchildren, will continue to give my Shver and my Shviga a lot of nachas. We're going to start with the Tehillim. We're going to ask 3 of his grandchildren, 3 of my nephews, to come up and say the Tehillim. You have it in the card. We're going to ask Yisrael Feldman to come do Kapitel Kuf Chaf, and Fali to do Kuf Chaf Aleph, and Kapitel Pei Beis.
Shir Hamal El Adonai Batzarasoli Krasi Vayaneni Adonai Hatzil Nafshi Misfashek Melasher Mia Mai Tilcho Mai Siflach Lasher Mia Chitze Gibber Shanun Magachler Samim Oil Likiyar Temeshach Shachante Malikidar Rabba Shach Nola Nafshim Seni Shalim Ani Shalim Vchid Abraham Alam Chama
Shir Hamal Esa Einai El Harim me ayin yava Ezri me Madinai Oisa Shemaim V'Aretz Ayit in Lamed Raglacha Yanum Shemerecha, Hine Lo Yanum V'Lo Yishar, Shem Yisrael, Adonai Shemerecha, Adonai Tzilcha, Al Yad Yeminecha, Yomim HaShemesh, Lo Yakeka V'Yareach B'Layla, Adonai Yishmarcha Mikol Ra, Yishmar Es Nafshecha, Adonai Yishmar Tzeischa, V'Yacham Yatav Ad Mizbar Lasav Elahib Ditzav, Vadas El, Beker Elahib Yishbait, and Masay Tishbetu, Avel, Fnei Reshayiv Tisu Sela, Shiftu Davi Yasem, Ani Varash Hatstiku, Pautu Dava Evian, Miad Rashai Matzilu, La Yadu Layavinu, Bacha, Shecha is Halachulai, Yimaitu, Kol Maisi Aretz, Ani Amarti Elahim, Atabu Videa Yad Kolchem, Achikadab. Temusa Chachad Hasarib Tipailu Kubel Hib Shafta Eretz Kiata Sidcha B'Chol Gayim.
It's Tufshin Tes, 1949. The Frierdiker Rebbe calls into his room a chassid, an American-born chassid, and suggests to him that he should go on shlichus to a city down south. At that time, in 1949, there weren't thousands of shluchim. There wasn't the kinnis of shluchim. And that shliach hesitated. The Frierdiker Rebbe said to him, the neshama, before it comes down into this world, it hesitates. The neshama says, why should I come down into this world when it's cold and it's dark? And the Frierdiker Rebbe said that the malach tells the neshama, you have to go down where it's dark and cold, was es kalt und finster, und dorten darfst du bringen Warmkeit und Lichtigkeit. And there you have to bring warmth and light. When the chassid heard these words from the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Frierdiker Rebbe pointing to go down, go south, this chassid realized this was his mission, this was a shlichus, and this chassid was Rabbi Zalman Posner. This is 1949. He went there, Elul, Tufshin Tes, and was there Shoshana, and a few months later, he got married, and his Rebbetzin joined him during the Sheva Brachas in Nashville, Tennessee. 15 years later, a young American couple comes to Nashville, and they connected to the Posners, Rabbi Rebbetzin Posner, and they felt the warmth and they felt the light. And Rabbi Rebbetzin Posner started bringing the warmth and the light and the lichtigkeit, the chassidishkeit, and skashus to my dear in-laws, Olav Shalom, Dr. Feldman, and Mrs. Feldman. First time I told this story was in my Chabad house in Chabad Riverdale. I believe it was on Sukkot, and my shver was sitting right there a few feet away from me. I told the story, and I continued saying whatever I said, and then I turned around, and I saw he was with tears coming down his eyes. I guess the story, he was recalling the story and recalling those few years, those few special moments that he was warmed up and had the chayis and the varmkeit for Rabbi Zalman and his wife, Rebbe Posner, and this is the beginning that brought him to the Rebbe, to Lubavitch, and to Chassidishkeit. His oldest daughter, Vivi Darren, shlucha in Stamford, Connecticut, remembers this beginning of Dr. and Mrs. Feldman by the Posners, and she wrote some very beautiful words and would ask Rabbi Zalman Posner's grandson, who's my brother-in-law, Rabbi Yossi Darren, Shliach in Chabad of Greenwich, to please read his mother's words about Dr. Feldman. It's right over here.
Growing up in the home of my parents, Rabbi Zalman and Rebbetzin Risya Posner, in the 1950s and the 1960s gave me a unique window into a very special time in the history of the Jewish people in 20th century America. My parents were Shloishim, sent by the Rebbe to Nashville, Tennessee, with the mission of lifting up the lives of Yidden wherever they would find them. There were Holocaust survivors. There were third-generation Jews from assimilated backgrounds in Germany. There were immigrants from Eastern Europe with their proudly American first-generation native-born citizens. And there were so many others. Nashville was the proud home to several universities and medical schools. And over the years, my parents were in contact with a number of transplanted Yidden, mostly from New York, who found themselves somewhat bewilderedly in the middle of a deep South community with no idea of how to function Jewishly. The Feldmans were among these couples, but from the beginning, even I, as a young teenager, knew there was something very special here. They were by no means Jewishly illiterate. By the standards of typical practice in Nashville, they were quite knowledgeable and observant. Sometimes people are frozen in that position. This is what I do, this is what I've always done, and that's just fine for me. Thank you very much. And here is where the Feldmans were different. In three beautiful ways. Number one, they were not stuck in where they were. They were awake and aware, interested in learning more, and not afraid of where that would lead them. Number two, they had tremendous respect for each other, and they gave space for each other to move at a pace that was comfortable for each of them. And number three, they had, at that time and for the rest of their lives, the incredibly generous gift of expressing gratitude. It is often difficult for people to acknowledge those who guided their path in Yiddishkeit. And even when they can express these feelings to those who guided them, very often people find it difficult to acknowledge this publicly. But it's truly a mark of humility and authenticity and genuine gratitude to be able to put this idea into words, bepem mole, as the Feldmans both did. The gratitude that they had so generously and so genuinely when speaking about my parents. Although I can honestly say that I never saw my mother interact with people in the community with anything less than full attention and dedication and care, nevertheless, there was something about this relationship that stood out to me. I have an image of Miriam standing in our kitchen the day before the bris of their oldest son, having just run to the grocery store to pick up some needed items. My mother was distraught. "You shouldn't be running around. Why didn't you tell me what you needed?" It felt to me like she was talking to a younger sister, and it was a lesson in what connections and shlichus should look like. I think of it often, and I strive to emulate it. After they left Nashville, the Feldmans stayed in touch with my parents, and they would happily join for simchas and family occasions. One image that I cherish and will always treasure is when Sarah and Levi's twins were born, and my parents surprised them by coming to the bris. I couldn't say who was more excited about this, my parents or the Feldmans. But one thing I could see for sure, this was a personal simcha for my parents, and they were both very emotional about the schus to participate personally in this simcha. 14 years ago, our mother passed away in Nashville, and we came to New York for the Levaya. I don't remember the details of how it happened, but we sat Shiva in New York in the Feldman home. We were cared for like royalty, literally like family. An image that stands out for me was the gentle and caring way that Dr. Feldman looked after my father. With his incredibly busy schedule, he managed, nevertheless, to almost always be right there, attentive to my father's every need or want. I recently heard a definition of bittul as not meaning thinking less of oneself, but rather thinking of oneself less. The stories of Dr. Feldman that Bahashgacha Pratis were published the day that he was nifter expressed this quality of bittul in the relationship that he was zeicha to have with the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin. In the countless stories that have been told in the last weeks, this quality of bittul, of thinking of oneself less, emerge over and over again. We were blessed to be given glimpses of true greatness and to see over the years how the tremendous opportunities that came their way and the incredible connection to the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin only brought out this quality of bittul, of true humility, even more so. May the shining example of both Dr. and Mrs. Feldman serve as a beacon of light, guiding the lives of their children and grandchildren, and all who were blessed by their presence, to continue the beautiful lives they lived, bringing nachas to them in their very lichtige Gan Eden. And may the Eibishter quickly bring about the time of a hakitza v'rananu sheichne ofar, v'heim b'seicham, with the coming of Mashiach now.
So we started with Nashville. In Nashville, Tennessee, a very dear friend, Rebbe Moshe Kedlarsky, met them when my shver was in Meharry College, and continued on to be a very close and dear friend of my shver, my shvig and the Feldman family. They hosted my brother Yitziel Vashalom's bar mitzvah in their house, you and your wife. They hosted the breakfast after Sarah and I got married. Many, many Shabbosim and many, many Yom Tovs. They felt welcome, they felt comfortable in the house of Rabbi and Mrs. Moshe Kedlarsky. So Rabbi Kedlarsky, please say a few words.
First thing I'll say is that I'm confident that Milmila, Dr. Feldman, is watching out in Bedford for Shloishim or for Kreva, for all of the people of Crown Heights who possibly are going through a hard time now with too much COVID. And they should help that Zitz b'Mereimim, I'm sure he's being mishamished and being by the Rebbe, that his tefillas for everybody should be niskabel. I met him the first time actually in Congregation She'ereth Israel. I came there for a mincha, and he was there, and he was the first person that walked over to me to give me Shalom Aleichem. Very young, didn't have, and he came over with a warmth that you don't find. He had one friend there that were two Balshemski Yidden that I got to know very well later. Was him and a Yid by the name of Sam Silverman, Olav HaShalom. And we got to know each other the next day, and I went on to Memphis. And thank you. And then I got a call from him that he's coming to do a residency or whatever it is at Einstein, and he's going to be in the Bronx. I think I was his first friend in Crown Heights. And there were many times that he popped in by us, but with Yom Tovim, like Levi said. But I just want to talk about the essence. I'm sure Dr. Rosen, a colleague, and to see one colleague to be here for another colleague is in itself a test to the breitkeit of Dr. Feldman and the friendship he had with everybody that there was. I want to go to the essence of who Dr. Feldman really was, which is negayah to us, Chabad Chassidim, to the Rebbe's Chassidim. There's a story told of the Alter Rebbe that he had an einikel, that one day the Alter Rebbe saw he was wearing a very expensive gartel. And the Alter Rebbe went over to him and asked him, how much did you pay for it? Called him over and he asked him, how much did you pay for it? He said he paid 15 ruble. The Alter Rebbe said, so much money you spent on a gartel, what are you splurging like that for? So he said, I wanted the gartel. So the Alter Rebbe said, where did you have money from? He said, I got Naden. How much did you get for Naden? He says, I got 2,000 ruble. So the Alter Rebbe pointed to his drawer where he held the money for tzedakah that the Alter Rebbe gave out everything that he had, he gave away. And he said, I want you to deposit it here. So the einikel started to argue with him and this. And the end result is he did not. He did not give it to me. He gave it away to him. He says, what are you going to do with it? I'm going to give it away to a businessman who I'm sure is going to do well for me in it. And I'll be able to have some money for the future. He says, Alter Rebbe asked him, what are you going to do if he's going to go bankrupt and he's going to lose it? Or something will happen to him? So he says, I don't think such a thing will happen. And he didn't take the Alter Rebbe seriously. The day came, Taki gave away the money to him, and there was a fire, and the guy's house burned down, and everything that he had, all these 2,000 ruble, went down the drain. The Alter Rebbe called in the einikel, and he said, why didn't you listen? And the einikel didn't have what to say. So he says, listen, I want to tell you a story. I was once traveling to Mazrich, and I was very, very frozen. We were traveling and it was so cold out that we finally came to an inn. The wagon driver had to carry me in, and the guy that owned the inn was an old Jew. He saved my life by rubbing snow into me. After I came to myself and I asked him, do you live here? He says, yeah. He says, no, and what about a minyan? He says, you can't get a minyan over here. So he says, what do you do? He says, I go every Yontif and Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, I go to the town and I daven in the city. So the Alter Rebbe says, a Yid, 70 Jahre alt, a ganze Leben gelebt on a minyan. So, and that was it. So he said, and then the Alter Rebbe tells him, you should know, I'm a Talmud of the Maggid of Mezrich. The Alter Rebbe went into the room that he was giving, came out a half hour later, saw 2 wagons, and the house was emptied of everything. He asked the Jew, where are you going? He says, you just told me I should move to the city. I'm moving to the city. Took everything out of the house and moved out. He says, so the Alter Rebbe told his einikel, their Poshet, their Yid, had such an emunas tzaddikim. such an emunah tzaddikim, that he listened to me only because I told him I'm Talmud of the Maggid of Mezrich, and you're my Yenikol, and you didn't listen. It's hard for me to call him Dr. Feldman. It's hard for me to call him Moshe Feldman. Bob and Myra were part of our life. You know, Bob Feldman was that Jew who listened to the Rebbe without batting an eyelash. I met him about 2-3 months ago. I said, Bob, you thinking of retiring? He says, I was by the Rebbe. The Rebbe told me not to retire. He says, I shouldn't think of retiring. He told it to me before Tovshon Nun Beis. He told me not to retire. He says, I am not going to retire. I'm going to work till my last day. It came to live in the Bronx. He wanted to leave the Bronx a couple of years early. I remember he used to tell me when he used to come in sometimes for supper or whatever it is, he used to say, you know, I wish I had already my house over here. He says, the Rebbe said no. Everything that his iskashus to the Rebbe and his unwavering, I'm not talking about him as the doctor. I'm not talking about the fact, there's one fact that he was the first one that understood that when the Rebbe said in Tovshin Lamed Ches, he doesn't want to go to the hospital, that the Rebbe meant it. I remember speaking to him about it. He says, I'm going to argue with the Rebbe. Left that for other people to argue with the Rebbe. I wasn't going to argue with the Rebbe. That unwavering hiskashus that he had was a Baal Shemske unwavering hiskashus. And I think that is what we have to take, the Chai Yitin El Libai, that we could walk away from his life and from Myra's life. Moshe and Miriam, it's hard for me to say it, I'm sorry. I grew up, they've been to me since 1968, 69. He was Bob, she was Myra. It's hard to, to change. So, but this part of them, of him especially, and of Myra, that they became chassidim of the Rebbe, not like chassidim metaskola, that they thought everything through. The Rebbe said something, there was no questioning what the Rebbe had to say. And before we go into what kind of a doctor he was, dedicate all of the things that everybody will talk about. To me, he was a chassid par excellence. And I bless the day that they came into our lives, and they should help. I'm sure he's up by the Rebbe because he didn't ask any questions there either. You know, he went where they told him to go, and they told him to go to the Rebbe, and he went to the Rebbe. Is all the time. A gute better for uns alle. And we soll sagen, wie Kitzu Veran und Sheikh Niyofa, Vehem Besoichem. And we should be together with the Rebbe when the Rebbe will come back and take us out of Golis, and he'll be right behind him. L'chaim, l'chaim.
Thank you very much. You know, many times my shver would talk about that Chassidus discusses this bitul hayesh, and this bitul hametzias, and this bitul hametzias mamish. I was always wondering what he means, what is he discussing, but thinking back to my dear shver, Dr. Feldman, that's the kind of life he lived. Pashit, bitul, b'mtzias mamish, there was nothing about him. It was his connection to the Rebbe. It was what the Rebbe said. That's what he did. Talking about he worked till his last day. It was about 10 days before he was nifter. And one of his grandchildren were in the car with him. It was about 1 a.m. And they said, Zaidi, where are you going? He said, no, I have to go to somebody in Flatbush. Who are you going to? It's a patient. I have to make a visit. I have to call. I have to go visit her. She's not doing well. But come on, Zaidi, it's late. It's 1 a.m. Yeah, but she's older. She's an elderly lady. Oh, how old is she? She's almost 80. So the angel says, Zaidi, you're turning 81 in 2 weeks. No, but she really needs me. And he didn't hesitate. He went, and this was a davara pashat for him. It didn't need much effort. A yid needed him wherever, whenever. He was there, devoted to help another yid. After Nashville, as was said before, my Schwieger, Dr. and Mrs. Feldman, moved to the Bronx, where my father-in-law was working in Einstein. And the way the story goes is they had to send the kids to yeshiva. They looked up the telephone book and they saw Lubavitch Yeshiva. They said, oh, Lubavitch in Nashville was great. So let's call Lubavitch Yeshiva. They called up Lubavitch Yeshiva, and Yitzi, Alav Shalom, and Tzibad L'chaim Tevim, Sarah, and David, and Hanan went to the Lubavitch Yeshiva of Rabbi Mordechai and Rachel Oltein, and stayed very, very close, and we're forever indebted to them too. And I'd like to ask our dear Rabbi Label Oltein to please say a few words on behalf of the Oltein family. Bring ein bisschen Wasser da noch. Ein bisschen Buschete Wasser. L'chaim. We all know that the Rebbe would send to a doctor, he would say, Arefe mumche yedid. Arefe yedid. Well, Dr. Feldman was a Arefe yedid for many, many mishpochas on Crown Heights. He was a family doctor for many mishpochas. But for our family, he wasn't a family doctor. He was a doctor who was family. It's very hard to explain it. But Dr. Feldman, Dr. and Mrs. Feldman, they were mamish, to my parents, they were mamish like family. Well, Levi asked me to come and say a few words. So I gedacht, was habe ich zu sagen? Ich bin nicht der größte Redner, I'm not a big speaker, but it's poshet a chayv. The Ashgacha process made it that I was the only child of my parents who lived besmichas to them. So I'll be din. So I was supposed to, I have to take care of them. Lepel, who took care of them? Dr. and Mrs. Feldman. They took care of them, manchmal wie Kinder zu Eltern. Manchmal wie Kinder zu Eltern. So Poshet, was sicher gedacht haben sie getan. Bin ich da Poshet am Algeven, Poshet te werden. I just want to say one small word. We all heard before that Dr. Feldman was a chossid, a doctor, a chossid. This is a chont, but it's interesting because it's not so poshet. A person who's a doctor, a good doctor, so everything is uiza cheshment, according to Teva, you know, what's going to work, what's not going to work. But a chossid, a doctor, a chossid is going to be anders. Now, the Rebbe got a doctor. Was the Rebbe wollte haben a doctor? Dacht nicht, der Rebbe hat einmal gesagt, befehlisch in der Sicher. Als Tome, wir darf haben etwas an Yeshua, nicht Punkt in Teva, sondern wir haben einen Doktor, der soll durchführen die Sache. Auf dem darf man einen Doktor, ein Chossid. Verstehst? A Yeshua, was es hat a Keli in Teva, ist das, any Doktor kann helfen. So ich sage meistens, was Menschen haben gehabt Probleme, und da haben sie geschickt zu verschiedenen Doktoren, Punkt der Doktor, was hat gewusst, der Machle, aber so da a Sache, was es Lamaile man hat Teva, was misbal mich in a Klient Teva. Aber so da a Sache, was Lamaile man hat Teva, was hat nicht ein Keli in Teva.
The Lashon is, so many in Achiza in Teva. And Achiza in Teva means that Alpi Teva it can't work Alpi Teva. But it's cooked to epis that it's Teva. But it's nicht Mamish Teva. So if Azar sagt, darf man sein a Doktor, a Gräse Maimen, a Gräse Chosid. Ist für solche Issues von an Achiza in Teva, dort hat a Doktor, a Chosid. Is a Doktor, was versteht, als von wann kommt der Rufur, der Rufur kommt a Chilf, mul Meile. Ich mag het am Meise. Ich denke, von der größten Pelische Rebbes, öfter von Dushim, ich denke schon welche. Der Meise geht da sei. Sie werden nach Chosid, was hat am Machle, und rein zum Dachscher Dushim, und gefragt, wo soll tun? Hat ihm gesagt, vor in Wien, zu der Doktor, und wird erzählen. Danach ist gekommen, ein zweiter Chosid, hat dieselbe Machle. Gehört, als geschickt in Wien zu dem Doktor, ist gelaufen in Wien zu dem Doktor. Und sie geholfen nach Gedoch, es ist gar nicht geholfen. Ist gelaufen zurück zu Dushim und gefragt, was ist der Chilik, was jenes gefahren und geschickt. Und sie geholfen, was ihm gefahren und es ist gar nicht geschehen. Hat ihm geöffnet, Chumash mit Rashi, Rabbi, mit kann, nicht in der Schuss Reifel, hat gesagt, mi kann schon nicht Rishus Reifel Rabbis. Es mi kann. Wenn der Rebbe schickt dort, jemand wird darauf vor, verstehst? Ist das davon ein Doktor, ein Chosid. Verstehst? Was soll ich sagen? Wie gesagt, das ist gewesen, ein Doktor am Spoche, Poschuft uns. Ich denke, wenn meine älteste Tochter ist geboren geworden, es ist keine Krankheit. Aber ein Newborn, you have to nehmen zu einem Doktor, was tut man? So we traveled to the Bronx. Ich denke, wir sind geschleppt bis in Bronx, aber es ist kein Doktor noch. Und der Nachbarschaft ist gewesen in Country, ich weiß nicht, die was gedenken, einfach vor dem Mamisch von Bongo County, Mongol County. Es ist kein Doktor dort. Und sie in Leitung hat Kinder mit auf dem Doktoren. Vielleicht Mama ist vor von Bongo County zu Bongo County auf Hälfte und sie in Leitung. Wie der Mann früher, seine Begebenkeit zu Menschen gewinnt ohne Gewuhl. Und Rebbe soll helfen, wir sollen uns davon kein Doktoren bekommen. Einmal hat Chilui Osam Alecha. Soll das Pedal sein, mein Rebbe und mein Chaim.
And I remember very often being a doctor and Mrs. Feldman, my Shverish figures Shabbos table, and Rabbi Mordechai and Rochel all time were there Shabbos after Shabbos, and for them it was the biggest coven schus to have your parents at that table. Reference what you just said, Rabbi Oltein, your sister Malka Oltein Cohen from Manchester wrote to Sarah, that she was once in Crown Heights and she came to my Shver's office, Dr. Feldman. And at the time, they had a connection to a young doctor who was getting close to the Yiddishkeit, but he had a problem. How could we ask the Rebbe about medical issues? So when she was by Dr. Feldman, she asked, how would Dr. Feldman, answer this doctor? So my Shver looked at her and said, only someone new in the field can ask such a question. The more you're involved in medicine, the more you see only Yad Hashem. The more you realize you need Torah and the Rebbe to guide you. A person's body is mamish all nisim and wonders of the Eibishter. The bigger the doctor, the more he should realize it is only the Malach of Hashem guiding him. And obviously, that was the way my Shver told others, and that's the way he lived his life. We're now going to show a few moments of a gem video that was organized by my dear brother Akiva Nussbaum, and we're going to show it now on the screen.
I mean, it was interesting because having spent a lot of time right here on Eastern Parkway as a young child, we never really knew about the Lubavitch or the Lubavitcher Rebbe. You must remember in those years, Eastern Parkway was filled with Jews of various groups, including Crown Heights. So there's no one thing that stood out. My first meeting face-to-face, with the Rebbe was, other than for Brengens, a more personal contact was in Lamed Ches, when the Rebbe had the heart attack. In those years, I was I was involved heavily with the intensive care unit at Einstein, taking care of the children that went to open heart surgery, and also doing high risk, you might say high risk of consultations on very sick children, and even cooperating with the adult staff also in terms of the sickest of what we felt were the most sick in the area. So when I came to Crown Heights, we came to Crown Heights for the Lamed Ches, that was our first Tishrei in Crown Heights. I mean, having been here for Brengens, I was familiar with the Rebbe already. We were in the back of the shul in Crown Heights. It was very crowded. It was Shmini Atzeres. And with my children and I were on the bleachers, the old bleachers that used to be in the back of the shul. And all we knew is that the shul was very crowded. And when we got out, we realized that the Rebbe was sick or needed some help and might have had a heart attack or just needed air. I ran back. We were staying with the Metzgers. That's Alter Ben Sion, Rabbi Dr. Alter Ben Sion Metzger and Yehudis Metzger. And in those years, because I was so trained, I spent more time in the intensive care units than I did even at home. I carried all my equipment with me to resuscitate people, anybody, anywhere. I was prepared for anything, it was just kind of my natural, that's what I did. So I brought with all the resuscitation equipment I needed to resuscitate almost anybody. And I ran back to the Metzgers. I brought the equipment with me. We went back to 770. And at that point, as I got there, the Rebbe was walking into the sukkah with Rabbi Dr. Seligson and his wife. And when he came out of the sukkah, he still didn't look so good, but he went back into his room. When the Rebbe went into the room, there were a few physicians there. There were about at least 10, 12 physicians who were in the shul at the time, there to also everyone wanting to assist the Rebbe in any way possible. Somehow some people recognized me, knew me, and allowed me to be one of those people who got in toward the Rebbe. But we were mostly in what we would call Gan Eden Takton, and we had to stay outside the Rebbe's room. And little by little, some of us were allowed in the room as we realized that the Rebbe just didn't feel well. Was more sick than we really wanted. It wasn't just a routine illness. One by one, the other physicians who were there had left. They figured there was just nothing more they could do for the Rebbe. And the Rebbe just, as I said, just looked sick, but we did not have a specific diagnosis, although we suspected it could be heart, because he was a little bit short of breath. The only ones left, basically, at the end, those of us there were a few of us left. There was Dr. Lev, Dr. Winch, and Dr. Bob Richter, and me. And we, around midnight, we decided that the few of us who were there were going to split up our shifts because we just needed to be alert. I stayed because I felt that if anything was going to happen for cardiac patients, it frequently happens late at night. Usually, as the circadian rhythms of the body change, there's more of a chance for a cardiac problem to manifest itself. around 12 o'clock, about midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, the only ones left at that point were Dr. Richter and myself. And we decided that he would take the first shift and I would go lie down. He would take the first shift watching the cardiac monitor, which we had set up right outside the Rebbe's room in the area we call Gan Eden Taktainam. And I would lie down. I was going to lie down on the floor, right where the sink used to be in that area. So I was about to lie down. As my head got halfway down to the floor, Dr. Richter, who was watching the monitor, banged on a chair. And I never made it. My head never made it to the floor. I got up, and we saw that the cardiac rhythm of the Rebbe changed drastically. It went from an otherwise normal rhythm to a very, very bizarre pattern, which we realized was very, very ominous. I had already prepared the hour before, I already prepared some solutions, intravenous solutions to give the Rebbe to calm the heart down or to assist in the beat, in the rhythm of the heart and the work of the heart. So we went into the Rebbe, he and I, and we explained to we went into his room. Rebbe, we had his bed set up for the Rebbe in his room. We went into the room and explained to the Rebbe that there was a change in the cardiac pattern, and we were going to have to start some medication. Going back, and so we started the medication. After the other doctors had left, I thought I would also try to convince the Rebbe to go to the hospital. I explained to the Rebbe that we had a lot of cardiac equipment here. We had many things we could do to help him, equipment-wise, but it would still be better to have a full staff and to have even more extensive equipment available in an intensive care unit in a hospital. The Rebbe still didn't want to go. It was just the Rebbe and I in the room, just the Rebbe and me in the room at that time. He said, "Do you see this desk?" I said, "Yes." He pointed to his desk, he pointed to his chair. "Do you see my chair? Do you see these books?" And each time I said, "Yes, yes." He said, "This desk and this chair and these books have heard the tears and the energy of my Hasidim, of all my Hasidim, and this is the energy that's going to get me better." So I couldn't argue with that because I knew that there was something going on over and above what, also going back to another hour or two before this episode where the heart attack began to manifest itself on the cardiac monitor, going back around 10 o'clock at night or so, the night of Shemini Atzeres, I went into the Rebbe's room to see how the Rebbe was doing. And the Rebbe looked at me, and it was just the Rebbe and me in the room. The Rebbe looked at me and said, "How are things going?" So I thought to myself, he knows more about his cardiac status, his physical status than I probably do. So somehow the idea came into my mind to tell him, I still see the Hasidim dancing and singing. I still see people dancing and singing even in the streets. The Rebbe looked at me and smiled and shook his head yes.
So I guess, Rabbi Galarski, you're right. He was a doctor, but I think first he was a chassid and totally bottle to the Rebbe from the first moments when he met the Rebbe personally in Lamed Ches. When my Schwer and Schwiger and the Feldman family moved to Crown Heights, they were coming from the Bronx, and it wasn't so easy to get used to living in Crown Heights with Lubavitches and Lubavitch yeshivas. And they had a very, very close friend, Rabbi Mashpia, Rabbi Shapiro, Rabbi Levi Shapiro Alav Shalom, and he was there with them before they moved to Crown Heights to be with them and teach them in the Bronx. He came every single day after yeshiva to learn with Sarah, with Yitzi, with David and Hanan, to spend time with them just to get them into the learning and into the yeshiva and everything else that they needed. The next speaker actually is here to present himself, but Yingi Bistrinsky. But actually, Yingi Bistrinsky actually goes back to the connection that my dear Shver, Dr. Feldman had with his father, your father, Rebbe Bistritsky, was a dear friend. As a matter of fact, your father, I believe, I'm quite sure, started Hatzolah here in Crown Heights, and it was my dear Shver Dr. Feldman who was the first medical director of Hatzolah in New York. But their relationship goes back even before that, when my in-laws lived in Nashville, Tennessee. So my Shviger's mother, Mrs. Feldman's mother, would go to the Lower East Side to your father's appetizing store, and they'd pack up a huge box of kosher food to send him to Nashville. So it's an honor to ask Rabbi Yingi to say a few words.
I took off my jacket so I shouldn't fashem Dr. Feldman because I never saw him on a call with a jacket. He usually had Post-it notes under his tie clip, pens, papers in his pocket. So, good evening, Rabbanim, family, friends, relatives, colleagues, David, Hanan, Sarah, and Rivki. It's hard for me to stand up here and talk about Dr. Feldman in past tense. I was just listening tonight on my phone. I had some messages from him as late as, I think, 11/21/21, several weeks ago. Our relationship started well over 40 years ago when Hatzolah started in Crown Heights. Dr. Feldman was a very unique individual. He did not have the words no, I can't, or I will not. Rabbi Shem Tov mentioned already that Dr. Feldman was Central Hatzolah's medical control doctor for the whole Hatzolah at the time. Any protocol, any legality, he was involved in it. If we had an issue on a call, if someone passed away, God forbid, he was very involved. There are many stories I can share. I'm not going to bore you. I'm going to tell you a couple of them. Back in the beginning when Hatzolah started, we had beepers. They were almost as big as this radio at the time. And the dispatcher would call a number and dial in your unit number and actually talk to you. You couldn't answer, but the dispatcher talked to you. I'm standing one day on Kingston Avenue in Heshy and Isaac's store, those of you that remember, all of us Shalom. They were Hatzolah members. And my beeper went off, and the dispatcher, who happened to be a woman that day, asked me if I can call in. I called in from their store, and she said to me, can you go pick up Dr. Feldman? I said, sure, where do I got to take him? They said, to Uraim Chapel in Williamsburg. Okay. Hatzolah started in Williamsburg. Crown Heights was the second neighborhood. I put my light on the top of the car. It's not like today, light bars and lights all over the car. It was this little cherry we put on the car. We had a little toot-tooted siren. I picked him up. We go to Williamsburg. We're talking on the way. I didn't know why we were going. I turn the corner onto Broadway by the chapel. I don't see any people. There's one or two cars on the street. I couldn't figure out why we're going there. We get out of the car, we go inside, and one of the Chevra Kadisha says to us, come. Oh, so we come. Brings us to a body, and he says, I just picked this gentleman up in Beth Israel in the city, and I could swear I heard him talking. In the back of the car, Dr. Feldman takes out this little gizmo, size of my radio, had a probe coming out of it, had wires coming out of it. He starts pushing and doing and going for about 15 minutes. Finally, he said, "Guy's gone." That was like one of my early things I had to do with him. He took away some of my thunder in the video because I was going to talk about Tafshin Lamed Ches, that he came running with an old EKG machine back from the Roaring 20s to the Rebbe's room. During the time after Chav Zayin Adar, I was lucky enough to be one of the people in the Rebbe's room. There were numerous times during the late hours of the night and early morning where we needed some advice, and I'd wake up Dr. Feldman and he'd be there in a heartbeat. Never said no. One thing you know about Dr. Feldman, if you were his patient, the pharmacies on the avenue would have parnassa. When he got done examining you, he made sure that every medicine the FDA approved for your particular ailment would be prescribed. There's a friend of mine that lives on Crown Street. He has 14 or 15 children, Kanai Nahara, and they were Dr. Feldman's patients. So if a patient came to Dr. Feldman after the pharmacies were closed, and he, in his big medicine cabinet, glass and metal in his office, happened to have not had the medicine you needed, he'd give him this guy's address on Crown Street, say, "Go knock on the door, he will have it." Because, one kid had allergies, one kid he had every kind of medicine, and he still does. About a year ago, I'm walking home from shul Friday night, and someone's standing in front of our dear Dr. Rosen's house. And he stops me and he asks me, "Do you know where I can find Dr. Rosen?" I said, "Dr. Rosen is not here for Shabbos." I said, "He's away." I asked him, "Can I help you?" He said, my child has a history of seizures, and his neurologist doubled his medication today. However, when I went before Shabbos to pick it up, the pharmacy was closed. He says, "I don't know what to do now." I said, "I'll tell you what to do. Go over to 1401 President Street, knock on Dr. Feldman's door. What kind of medicine do you need?" He says, Keppra. Keppra is a seizure medication, anti-seizure. He said, "But I'm not his patient." I said, "Don't worry. Go to Dr. Feldman. If he doesn't have it, he will write you a script." And I told him where there's an open drugstore at that time of the night. And he picked it up. Just several months ago, I met this gentleman. He says, "Do you remember me?" I said, "No." He says, "I was in front of Dr. Rosen's house, and I asked you." And he thanked me again, and he said, "Dr. Feldman was so nice to me, and I wasn't even his patient." Dr. Feldman knew not only regular medical, normal ways of doing things, he had some unconventional ways that he did things. Magnets, pressure points, non-FDA stuff you can buy in a drugstore. I called this person today to verify the story. He actually forgot the story, and I reminded him, and I asked him if I can use his name, and he said yes. About 30 or 35 years ago, Chaim Baruch Halberstam had terrible pain going down his arm for days. One Friday night, he came downstairs, and he's looking for Dr. Feldman. He couldn't take it already. Found him. I happened to be standing right near him, under the clock. Tells Dr. Feldman what's going on. He touches his hand. He plays with his ear for a couple of minutes, and he says, "You're good to go." His arm didn't hurt anymore. That was Dr. Feldman. He also told me today, Chaim Baruch, that whenever he passed the Rebbe, Dr. Feldman, he would tell him, as long as the Rebbitzin was alive, you are my doctor and the Rebbitzин's doctor. And after Rebbitzin passed away, he would tell him, you are my doctor. More recently, it was, I believe, Tishrei time. Dr. Feldman calls me on a Saturday night, Motzei Shabbos. He says, "Yengi, I need your help." I said, "What do you need, Doc?" He says, "It's a bunch of Bachrim on my porch. They want me to give them either notes to go back to whatever country they got to fly to, or vaccine cards." He says, "And I'm not doing that for them, and they're threatening me." I said, "Bob, I'll take care of it." I made a phone call. I called the Chapsam from here. They went over there because he says, "My patients can't come in. These guys are yelling at me. They're threatening me." And they got them to go away, and he was able to see his patients. Also recently, I'm going to call it maybe 3 months ago, Dr. Feldman calls me Friday night. I'm in the middle of a meal, my phone rings. He says to me, "Yengi, can you come pick me up?" I said, "Sure. Where do you want to go?" He says, "Come, I'll tell you." Get in my car, run up to his house. He comes out. No jacket, of course. Short sleeves. I don't have any short sleeve shirts. Mine are all long, sorry. He says, "I want you to take me to the other side of Crown Heights. I got to pick up some medicine. There's a woman that came home from the hospital today who has terrible diabetes. She couldn't get the medicine because it ran into Shabbos, and it's a big sakana, and she has to have it." I drove him the other end of Crown Heights. I said, "Let me go in and get it." He says, No, I'll go in." He went in. Then we came back this way to East New York Avenue. The lady lived on the 3rd or 4th floor. I said, "Doc, let me bring it up." He says, No, I'm going up. He walked up the 3 or 4 flights. He wanted to make sure the lady knew how to take the medicine, how much to take, and came back down. I drove him home. That was Dr. Feldman. Money meant nothing to him. Nothing. He didn't care about money. That was the last thing in his mind. I'd like to mention a short story about Mrs. Feldman, Olav Shalom. Being at her yard site, I believe it was Monday. I saw David and Shul, right? Monday. We all can learn from her frumkeit and edelkeit. There was never a time I rang the doorbell or pounded on the door, front or back, that she didn't open and say, "What do you need?" She never told me, "Dr. Feldman's resting. Dr. Feldman's sleeping. Dr. Feldman doesn't feel well." Always in a heartbeat, she went to get him. She was so frum that if you walked into her house, I believe from the week after Purim, you needed Ray-Ban sunglasses because of all the aluminum foil and plastic she had from the front of the house through the kitchen, because you couldn't bring any chametz in the house, and she wanted to make sure the house is the way it's supposed to be for Pesach. Not only that, the cushions on the couch, she locked up for Pesach, already right after Purim. I sat with Dr. Feldman on the couch. I was breaking my back. We were sitting on the wood. David, Hanan, Sarah, Rivka. Need to remember the good times, and there were a lot of them, I'm sure. And hopefully Mashiach will come soon together with all our loved ones.
The video is yet. The video. While Dr. Feldman took care of the Rebbe, Lamed Ches, they were organizing to get the top cardiologist in the United States to come in from Chicago. I called Dr. Ira Weiss a few days ago, 2 weeks ago, to let him know that unfortunately Dr. Feldman passed away. He was shocked. He felt terrible. And I asked him if he was okay sending us a video of some of his thoughts in honor of the Shloishim of Dr. Feldman. And we're now going to see a video of Dr. Ira Weiss.
Hi, this is Dr. Ira Weiss calling in from Chicago to tell the Feldman family how deeply saddened we are to hear about Dr. Robert Feldman's passing, and how much of a loss it is to all of us who took care of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. It may not be well known, but Dr. Feldman was one of the most important people on the team of the physicians who cared for the Rebbe and the Rebbitzin. We called upon Dr. Feldman whenever a need arose for him to be seen on short notice, for measurements to be taken, for blood samples to be drawn, and a number of other things that really took up his very precious limited time. As all the community knows, Dr. Feldman served his whole community in 770, night and day, as a servant to the entire community of Lubavitch in the neighborhood of the Rebbe. And whenever we would call him, it would be a terrible encroachment on his limited time with his family and with his patients. One of the most telling examples of how Dr. Feldman devoted himself to the care of the Rebbe was in his care of Rebbetzin Schneerson 4 years after the Rebbe had his heart attack. The Rebbetzin came down with a fever and was not feeling well at all. And over the telephone and calling the Rebbetzin, I determined that there was a possibility that her heart valve was infected. It's a disease called endocarditis. It's a complex disease. It's a very, very dangerous disease to be left untreated. And I asked Dr. Feldman to go over and see the Rebbetzin, which he did on several occasions. And finally, when we made the conclusion that she did have a disease called endocarditis, a heart valve infection, Dr. Feldman had to go 4 times a day to insert an IV into the Rebbetzins' arm to administer penicillin over a 6-week period. As many of you know, the Rebbetzin was a frail constitution, and correspondingly, her veins were very difficult to find. It was just torture for Dr. Feldman to be giving this dose to her, but we insisted that the Rebbetzin get 4 infusions a day, with each infusion being completed by taking out the needle so that we would not induce any possibility of infection. For 6 weeks, Dr. Feldman continued to give the medicine, which, thank God, was very effective in restoring the Rebbetzin to her full health in 1981. And without his help, we could not have possibly saved her life, nor would we have been successful in a hospital where the intravenous methods used at that time would be to leave indwelling catheters in the arm, which could cause infection. And we avoided all that because of Dr. Feldman's capability and diligence in helping the Rebbetzin get back to good health. This is only one example of many that I could cite of how Dr. Feldman helped the Rebbe and Rebbetzin. He was also a very dear friend. I could call upon him whenever I wanted to ask his advice and his support about issues that came up in the 15 years in which I actively followed the Rebbe's care. He certainly was an outstanding member of our medical team, and to say the least, a very good friend. And I will tell you that a loss for your community is a very big loss for me. I just will so much value my having had his friendship and his help and his professional expertise over the many years that passed in the time we took care of the Rebbe. And in the subsequent years when I didn't keep in close contact with Dr. Feldman, I always was mindful of his great contribution and his great friendship. I want to give him in heaven a blessing for what he has done for us, and I will tell you that really there's no one who could have matched what he did. I give my strong wishes of condolences to the entire family and wish to give you all a blessing for all your support to me. Thank you.
As mentioned before, that Lamed Ches, that was the first Tishrei that the Feldmans spent here in Crown Heights. It was a Simchas Torah the year before Lamed Zion, when they came home from Simchas Torah, I think 7 o'clock or 7:30, and they said, no, this is not the way we should celebrate it. And they made a decision, next year we're going to be in Crown Heights. And they stayed by Rabbi and Mrs. Metzger's house, and they became very, very close, always hosting them and helping them, and became very, very close and good friends of theirs. I also want to mention the office staff, Chana, Darcy, Zeldi, Devora, Rivka, Shana, who went beyond the call of duty and truly cared and showed it through reminding Dad the Shver to eat supper and other thoughtful gestures, and they were always there for him and always took care of him. Thank you. One time, my Shver, Dr. Feldman, was by the Rebbe, and the Rebbe told him that what they're discussing should not really be told to anybody. So my Shver told the Rebbe that there's one person standing outside the room, and that person is going to want to know what we discussed. And that person was Rabbi Zalman Gerari. And the Rebbe said to him, you could tell just a little bit. So we're soon going to hear from Rabbi Gerari, of Shalom's daughter's notes, what she wrote. And for now, we're going to ask my dear brother Hanan Feldman to read what Dr. Shalom Hirschman wrote, a letter about Dr. Feldman. Dr. Shalom Hirschman was one of the Rebbe's doctors, stayed very close with Dr. Feldman. I'd like to ask Hanan to come up.
I was deeply saddened by the news of the passing of my colleague and friend, Dr. Moshe Feldman, Olav Shalom. I first met Dr. Feldman when I was called to help care for the Lubavitcher Rebbe Zatzal. I was both impressed and touched by the devoted medical care given to the Rebbe by Dr. Feldman. It didn't take long for me to realize that Dr. Feldman was essential to the healthcare of the community in Crown Heights, treating patients with a deeply felt personal mission. Dr. Feldman embodied the qualities of a true physician, providing the medical care with utmost kindness and thoughtfulness. He was one of the major pillars of the community, and his loss will be felt throughout the world of Chabad. Yet I believe that he will be a Melitz Tov for all his patients and dear ones. Dr. Shalom Hirschman.
Esther Sternberg, who was very close with the Rebbe and Rebbetzin, she was there actually when our Rebbetzin passed away in the hospital. She was there, my Shver was there with the Rebbetzin, and her parents, Rabbi Zalman, and his wife, Gerari, were very close, my Shver and Shviger. So Esther Sternberg, wrote a few words. I'd like to ask my dear son, Menachem Mendel, to please read the words of Esther Sternberg, followed by a few other personal words.
And the living shall take to heart. Who am I to speak of this special personality, Dr. Moshe Olav Shalom Feldman? Who am I to speak of his tremendous deeds of chesed and Ahavas Yisrael? I am just one person, but my family had a very special personal relationship that grew from day to day, year to year. Dr. Feldman treated my parents, my children, my siblings with so much compassion, never stopping for a vacation or because of the late hour of the night. I always wondered how his family was able to watch him do this day in and day out with practically no sleep and always having emergencies on Shabbos and Yom Tov. But Dr. Feldman did not do this as a doctor. He did this as a true Jew who felt that Avos Yisrael is the key to Avos Hashem. His Avos Hashem was so great that he felt love for every Jew as a child of Hashem. I personally think that his motivation and his family acknowledged it. I personally think that was his motivation and his family acknowledged it and is so proud of him. We all know that he was a personal physician of our Rebbe and Rebbetzin. How we all were so jealous of his countless encounters with the Rebbe. But we realize that Hashem chose him, handpicked him, for this lofty shlichus of healing and advising Beis Harav. Surely everyone knows of his tremendous dedication to our Rebbetzin. I can attest to the fact that the Rebbetzin felt so comforted every time Dr. Feldman walked into her home. I myself have summoned him many times after the Rebbetzin complained of something to my father, and am witness to how he left a full office of patients to run to her to help her in just minutes. Dr. Feldman remained devoted to her for all those years until those last moments on Chaf Shvat. I will never forget how when Dr. Feldman realized that my father, alav shalom, was very nervous about his heart condition, he came up with an idea of how to soothe his anxiety. He told my father to buy an electrocardiogram machine, and he will teach me how to test whenever he felt unwell. I would then bring it to Dr. Feldman to read the printout. Painstakingly, Dr. Feldman sat and taught me to be an EKG technician. And every time I came with a printout, the receptionist dropped everything, gave the printout to Dr. Feldman, and within moments, Dr. Feldman came out to me, beaming, "He's fine." This didn't happen once or twice, but very often. But Dr. Feldman never tired of helping my father within minutes as if he were helping his own father. There is being a great doctor, there is being a great friend, there is being compassionate, there is being totally devoted, and then there is Dr. Feldman. All of the above and so much more. And this brings me to my first words. Who am I to speak about this great personality? But I was prompted by the feelings running through my head the moment I heard of the Patira. I was remembering learning about the Baal Shem Tov, and this story had an unbelievable impact on me. The Baal Shem Tov used to go from town to town, observing the different Yidden, trying to get them to do more mitzvahs. The Baal Shem Tov once came to a town where he noticed a man dressed in torn clothing, worn out shoes, carrying a very heavy sack on his shoulders. He looked so poor and simple, yet the Baal Shem Tov noticed a light shining over his head like a halo. The Baal Shem Tov was very eager to find out who was this special Jew, that obviously no one knew because passerbys would just laugh at him. The Baal Shem Tov was so eager that he took it upon himself a fast of 3 days and 3 nights, praying that Hashem will divulge the secret to him. On the 3rd day, the Baal Shem Tov followed this man and was finally answered. This man, called Herschel, had a very fine wife who raised goats and gave goats milk to the sick and infirm to heal them. She had passed away 10 years earlier, and during the Shiva, she came to her husband in a dream, and told him that here in Shemayim, my actions were deemed very precious. When I came to Shemayim, so many malachim that were created by each good deed came to greet me. Listen to me, she said. Continue to raise goats and heal the sick, and infirm them with goat's milk, because these mitzvahs are considered very special in Shemayim. My friends, the story continues on of how this man, Herschel, continued the mitzvahs for many years. However, when he passed away, no one knew of his greatness, and he was therefore not accorded the proper respect at his levaya because of this. It was decreed in Shemayim that the city is deserving of a great punishment. The Baal Shem Tov related that he and his colleagues tried to annul the decree, but to no avail. Suddenly, the Baal Shem Tov heard, make way, and there was Herschel's wife, together with an entourage of thousands of malachim, approaching the Kisei HaKavod, pleading that the city be spared because it was not their fault that they did not know who her husband was. The Baal Shem Tov concluded by saying, look at the merit that Herschel's wife had, that I and my colleagues were not able to annul the decree, and she, in the schus of her Ma'asim Tovim, was able to. How many hundreds of thousands of malachim were created by the mitzvahs that Dr. Feldman did? I beg of Dr. Feldman to gather all of those malachim and en masse demand at the Kisei HaKavod that Mashiach be revealed right now. Amen. I would like to share a few words of my own. When my twin sister and I were babies, my Zaidi would drive all the way to Riverdale after he finished seeing his patients, sometimes midnight or later, just to check on us if we weren't feeling well. And then as we got a little older, we would literally pretend to not feel well just to be able to go see Zaidi. When I fell while rollerblading once, it was only Zaidi who could convince me that it would be all right and I did not need to go to hospital for some bleeding on my lip. On the other hand, when I broke my hand from falling off my bike, I did not want to go anywhere near the hospital, only to Zaidi. He loved teaching me about the human body. He would show me x-rays and give me models. Remember one time on Hanukkah, I got a model of the human body, which I assembled together with him, as he patiently explained every detail, bit by bit, piece by piece. He loved it more than I did. As a matter of fact, allowing him to teach you was the greatest present you could ever give him. Whether it was in the medical world or in the world of gematrias, he would teach you as if he had nothing else to do. I had the schus of living by my Zaidi for the last 2 months. It was very special, spending so much quality time with him, but only after his passing did I realize what a great schus it really was. In my mind, it was a normal thing that even after he'd finish office hours, late at night, and he would come upstairs, eat supper, he would still be in touch with numerous patients, always on the phone, to make sure everything was okay with them. I also thought that it was normal that if I mentioned that I had a friend who was sick, he wouldn't blink before telling me to tell them that they should come right away to see him to make sure they're all right. But no, this is not a regular thing. It's not normal for a human being to dedicate his whole life and every aspect of his life to help others to this extent. But to my Zaidi, not only was it normal, but it was the only way to live. I just remembered, I want to share 2 stories. One, my Zaidi would always come to Riverdale every Sukkot and Pesach together with my Babi and my Uncle Yitzi. And when we were kids, we always loved asking him to come into our room at night and tell us a few stories. And he always put us to sleep like that. He would go on and on, never stopping. By Pesach, him and Babi would always ask my mother, what is there that we could do? We want to help you. So my mother said, usually I spend a whole day making gefilte fish. It would be a help if maybe you could go to Roskin's factory and be the mashgiach there. That way we could have gefilte fish for Pesach. And comes Pesach every year, and guests are sitting around the table. And my Zaidi's favorite part was when we would bring the gefilte fish to him, and he would show everyone the stamp, which said, Dr. Moshe Feldman. And he would say, I made that. I made that. Another thing, whenever we would give Zaidi a brand new shirt or anything to be worn that was clean, he would say, I can't wear that. No one's going to recognize me. I wouldn't want to finish off talking about my Zaidi without saying a short gematria. My Zaidi's Hebrew name, Moshe, had a few gematrias, but one that stood out to me was Olam Hazeh v'Olam Haba Yachad. Olam Hazeh, our physical world, and Olam Haba, the spiritual world. To Zaidi, he would always say how they are both one, and that everything in this physical world is only a manifestation of the spiritual world. But not only did he say it, but he lived by it too. He was always involved in helping people physically, and at the same time that he kept Torah and mitzvahs, and both with a great passion. There's so much I could say about my Zaidi, but no words can truly describe what a great person he was. I miss him very much. And just as I hope and daven every day to see him with the coming of Mashiach, I have no doubt that he is pleading and begging by Hashem to bring the Geula now. Thank you.
My dear Shver was very close with all the doctors at Livdikot Heights. He had a special relationship with Dr. Rosen, and they were very close and friendly in many, many ways, especially the last day of his life when we called on Dr. Rosen because we couldn't ask Dr. Feldman how to treat Dr. Feldman. So who did we call? We called Dr. Rosen. So please welcome Dr. Rosen.
Yingi already stole my line to honor Dr. Feldman. My colleague. It's a tradition to learn Mishnayos in honor of the deceased. And my favorite Mishnah is one of the last Mishnahs in Tractate Kedushin. And we've already had the disclaimer. We know that Dr. Feldman is in Gan Eden. Rebbe Moshe helped us understand why. So surely Dr. Feldman is in Gan Eden. However, the Mishnah says, whilst discussing whom one should not marry one's daughter to, you shouldn't obviously marry your daughter to a sailor. You shouldn't marry your daughter to a camel driver, keeper of the harem. And then, Tev sheberefim legehenim. Out of nowhere. Tev sheberefim legehenim. Very, very troublesome and something that's bothered me a long time. I know that Dr. Feldman is not shaykh to that, and I'll tell you why. One of the first reasons is Rashi brings over there, Rashi brings 3 pshetlach, and one of the reasons that Rashi brings is that when a patient is in front of a doctor desperate for healing, the best doctor can't avoid the opportunity to take as much as they can get from the patient. Rip flesh, as we call it. Reach into the patient's wallet. It was just not shaykh to Dr. Feldman to take advantage of a patient in any way. It's a profound thing. We live in a world today where medicine is a business, where patients are chattel. Dr. Feldman was so far beyond seeing his patients as a means of self-enrichment. So if that's one of the reasons that Rashi gives, it has no shaykhs whatsoever to Dr. Feldman. But on a more personal note, I've thought about this Mishnah a long time and what it means. It can't mean that the best doctors are headed that way, because then nobody would go into medicine, or no from Jew would go into medicine. The Mishnah says we're all going that way. So let's look at the Mishnah in its context a little bit. The Mishnah occurs in Kedushin, and it occurs in relation to the kinds of people that one shouldn't marry one's daughter to. So it must have something to do with the wife of the physician and the family of the physician. The best doctors, and the Mishnah states specifically Tev Sheberefim, the best doctors are devoted, and Dr. Feldman taught me devotion. I learned devotion from Dr. Feldman. Thank you, Bob. The best doctors are caring, involved, and affected. The best doctors feel the patient's suffering. When a person is sick, and particularly if they're in pain, they're in Gehenna. And we've heard tonight lots of stories about Dr. Feldman, how he endlessly would go out of his way
in the most selfless fashion and enter into that patient's life and share in that suffering. Take away a little piece of that Gehenna. That's what the Mishnah means. Tev sheberefim legehenna. Dr. Feldman, you certainly spent a lot of your time in Gehenna over here, in the Gehenna of all of your patients, and you took it away. Just little pieces, a little piece at a time. But you devoted yourself to doing that. You've done your time, more than your time. Enjoy your Gan Eden, be a good better for everybody down here. And I should continue to devote myself in the way that Dr. Feldman was devoted.
Since my shviger, Mrs. Feldman, passed away about a year ago, I want to mention specifically the Skabla and Boaz family, who literally every single week cooked and brought supper to my shver an entire year to make sure he had a warm cooked meal besides his daughters-in-law and the family did. The Skabla and Boaz family was always there for him. Thank you very much. I also want to mention my in-laws, Mrs. Feldman's neighbors, Rabbi Yossi and Bella Rabashkin, who were really, really shachin tev, shchenim tevim. I don't know if they're here. Is Yossi? Oh. And I want to mention that after they had the minyan in their house, they were going to stop the minyan, but they kept the minyan open past the time they needed in order to make it easier for Dr. Feldman to come and be there every single Shabbos. The Varmkeit and Ahavas Yisrael that you showed him and you gave him was of the highest caliber, and thank you very much. So there were many children, including myself, before I got married to Sarah. That was a patient by Dr. Feldman. As a matter of fact, he checked out every boy and every family way before they came up for Shidduchim. But there were many families that were patients by him, and then when they got married, their children went back to Dr. Feldman to be patients by Dr. Feldman. Tonight, I'm going to ask Rabbi Ephraim Mintz, who as a child, he and his siblings grew up going to Dr. Feldman. His wife and her siblings in the family grew up going to Dr. Feldman. And later on, all their children were going to Dr. Feldman. So I'd like to ask Rabbi Ephraim Mintz to say a few words.
Good evening. Oops, sorry. The story is told that the noted chassid, Rabbi Isaac Humler, one of the great chassidim of the Alter Rebbe, just prior to his passing, his close Talmidim, disciples asked him, Mit vos gehst du l'mayla? With what are you departing this world? What is that? How would you summarize your accomplishments in Olam Hazeh? And Rabbi Isaac thought for a moment, and then he turned to his Talmidim and responded, and he said that on one occasion, he was in the presence of the Alter Rebbe, and while the Alter Rebbe was davening or learning, a page of his sefer fell onto the floor. And Rabbi Isaac rushed over and lifted the paper and gave it back, lifted the page and gave it back to the Alter Rebbe. And he said, Midem geyech l'mayla. This is what I take with me. This is what I consider to be his greatest achievement. And Chassidim would bring a lot about this, for after all, Rabbi Isaac Humler was one of the great Chassidim who had so many Talmidim, who left an enormous impact in the lives of so many. And yet, when he was asked to summarize what he achieved in Olam Hazeh, he chose this episode to summarize his life. Rabbi Say, we heard tonight speaker after speaker, chaverim, friends, fellow doctors, mashpiim, rabbonim speak of their close relationship with Dr. Feldman, Olav Hashalom, and his wife, Aleim Hashalom. And speaker after speaker mentioned the same nekuda, each one in their own words, in their own language, or their own terminology. How many pages did Dr. Feldman lift? How many lives was he there for? Every single one of us sitting here either experienced personally or heard from others who did. Rabbi Shem Tov mentioned as a very young child, in fact, when Dr. Feldman, before he had his office, he would make house calls, and we were with a family with a bunch of children. He would frequent our home, visiting, and we never saw a doctor come to your home, and that was Dr. Feldman in his early days in Crown Heights. My mother told me she used to also go to the Bronx, like Rabbi Oltein mentioned. But as all of you have heard tonight, the incredible selflessness, literal Mesiras Nefesh, that we witnessed in this Gavra Rabbah, this incredible person who was Dr. Feldman, is something that we witness time and again. It's hard to share stories. There are so many stories. You've heard many tonight. Some that come to mind in our family. There was once on the day of a wedding of one of a family member, the Kala, something happened to her eye. The day of the Chasana. Dr. Feldman made sure to come to the house and put special eye drops in, and then again before the pictures, and then after pictures, and before the Kala came to the hall, guess who was waiting for her? Dr. Feldman was waiting in the hall for the Kala to come, because he was there waiting to put the eye drops in. It was well beyond the call of duty of an ordinary physician. There was a story with also a family member that a mother was about to, she was due and she was rushed to the hospital. The baby was born early. Dr. Feldman knew about it, and they suspected something might be wrong. Hatzolah took her to the hospital. Dr. Feldman, we're not sure how he found out, but he was there in Hatzolah, went to the hospital in Manhattan, and when Hatzolah left, he insisted to stay. And he stayed. He said, I'm not leaving the patient alone. He stayed, and he stayed after everything was fine. The doctor said the baby was fine, everything was fine. That's when he went home. This was Dr. Feldman. And there are so many stories of this mamish selflessness. If you notice in the video that we just watched, Dr. Feldman speaking, he said that he carried with him in Lamed Ches when he was here, which is the first time he was here in 770 for a Shabbos, for a Yom Tiv, he carried with him his medical gear. And if you notice the words that he said, naturally, he used the word, it was naturally what I did. Rabbi Say, I ask you, is that natural? Is that natural for a person? For Dr. Feldman, that was natural. But it's not natural. The way he said it, it's naturally I did it. That nature of Dr. Feldman, that nature is the miracle that we call Dr. Feldman. And sometimes only after a person leaves us do we start beginning to appreciate the enormous sacrifice. As we heard tonight, ma'at miz'er, just a little bit, the enormous dedication, starting with the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin. We knew as Bachrim, growing up, after the weekday Fabrengens, the Rebbe would be in his room. It was a Dover Kavua, I'm sure you remember, Levi. For 10 minutes or more, the Rebbe Dr. Feldman was checking the Rebbe after the weekday Fabrengens. Every weekday Fabrengen came out. In the MEMS, in the 80s, it was a Dover Kavua. And the Rebbetzin, many times when I was back to Dr. Feldman with a child or myself, I would ask him, I was trying to glean something from the Rebbe Dr. Feldman tried to turn the conversation and tried to hear. Dr. Feldman obviously was very guarded, but he always repeated two things to me that he heard from the Rebbe. Number one, he said about the preventive, how the Rebbe was always into not to wait to treat, but preventive, and he spoke a great deal about preventive medicine. And this was something he spoke about very often among the gematrias and the Fabrengens that turned out to be a doctor visit. And also he spoke about, you felt like you were visiting a Hamekubel. Whoever, he was, besides not only the gematrias, he Pashat had, like we heard from the old time earlier, he was a chassid and a doctor. And you saw it in how he spoke about the Rebbe, how he treated patients, how he looked at another Yid. Rabbi Sai, we're about to conclude the evening. By Chassidim, in Chabad, as we know, we don't say Hespedim. Tonight's Fabrengen, honoring the memory of Dr. and Mrs. Feldman, Aleim Hashalom, in the spirit of a Hacha Yitne Liboy, of taking with us, trying to internalize all that we heard tonight. I'm reminded of a story that I heard from a Yid. Also, I should mention also Dr. Feldman, not only being a patient and very close, our family, he also davened by us in Rabbi Getzel Shul, and he would also always share, always have something to share. Every time after I would say a sikha, he would come over with a story, a vort, a gematria. Always had something interesting to add. So once in Rabbi Getzel Shul, I heard from one of the Mispalim, Rabbi Shimon Galowinski, he said he was once in 770, in the 1970s, a regular day, a mincha and mariv in 770, and there were two chassidim that were preparing to daven mincha. Chassidim, many of us who knew them, Reb Zalman Teibel and Reb Shaya Matlin, two elderly chassidim. And as they're about to start davening mincha, Reb Zalman Teibel turns to Reb Shaya Matlin and says, Reb Shaya, hot a gartel? You have a gartel? I don't have a gartel on me to daven mincha. So Reb Shaya Matlin takes out his gartel and hands over his gartel to Reb Zalman Teibel. Reb Zalman Teibel tells Reb Shaya, mit was gehst du daven mincha? What are you going to daven mincha with? You're giving me your gartel. So Reb Shaya Matlin looked at Zalman Teibel and he said, Reb Zalman, davening mincha mit a gartel is a sheine minik chassidim. To daven mincha with a gartel is a nice minik chassidim. Aber zu tun a toive a Yidden is a mitzvahs essen min a teure. These words, this story tells us so much about the life and legacy of Dr. Feldman. Everything we heard tonight is not what Dr. Feldman did. It's who Dr. Feldman was. It's who he was. Everything about him. How often do we spend our time as chassidim trying to do the right thing? We spend time and focusing on our gartel, in whatever area of Yiddishkeit. But greater than worrying about our own personal gartel is the ability to rise above ourselves and give our gartel to another Yid. And that was what Dr. Feldman, that is who Dr. Feldman was. It wasn't just what he did, it is who he was. I remember during Shiva with Dr. Feldman, the family was sitting writing the Matzeva. And I was sitting with the family, and as they were writing the Matzeva, I turned to David and I said, the Seder is by Matzeva, Lekemish Wissen von Schreiben Matzeves. In the beginning of a Matzeva, first you write something about the person, himself, about the Mahusa Adam, and then his family, and then the community. But the family, Hatzolah wrote Dr. Feldman's name, and right after that, there was a reife, the Rebbe's and Rebbetzon's doctor, and I wrote for Yidid right away. So I told the family, l'chayre, it would make sense to write something first about himself, who he was, something about him, and then about what he did for others. And David right away stopped me and said, no. This is who he was. If you want to know who he was, this is who he was. He was in ganzen Moser v'nosen. Every fiber of his being was giving his gartel to others, not worrying about his own gartel. Chassidus speaks about it, Tainug Nivra versus Tainug Boirei. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu has tremendous satisfaction, Tainug Boirei versus Tainug Nivra, when we have Tainug. When a Yid has a Sheine, Seidene Gartel, no question, Tainug Nivra. But you know when this Tainug Boirei, when a Yid takes his Gartel and gives it to another Yid, that's when the Eibishter has his ultimate oineg and nachas ruach. And as Chassidim say, the Gemara says, when do we read Kriya Shema b'shachris? We must have Kohen Shema b'shachris in the morning. There's several opinions. One opinion is Misha Yakir es Chaveiroi Daled Amis. When you could recognize another Yid standing in your Daled Amis, it's light enough outside. You could recognize, you could see another person. That's when it's light enough to say Shema. So Chassidim say, it says in Helik Esfarim, before we declare, we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Echad, dafim deken noch hayid. When you recognize another Yid, when you recognize someone else needing a gartel, then it's time to put on your own gartel. So Rabbi say, in the spirit of Ahacha Yitna Liboy, as we leave tonight inspired, uplifted, and really moved to hear story after story of Dr. Feldman and how his entire life was dedicated b'mesira u'nesina, with mamish mesiras nefesh, to the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin and to Kahal Adas Achsidim. The greatest tribute and the greatest hesped is in the spirit of Achayit Neliboy, for us to leave inspired in some way, every single one of us, to emulate, to try to internalize Efes Kotseyu, a little bit of what we saw and witnessed in the life and legacy of Dr. Feldman. And I want to conclude with one brief story shared with us in a very unusual moment where the Rebbe Maharash shared. It was a Rebbe to Rebbe talk, if you could use that term. When the Rebbe Maharash shared in a very unusual moment with his son, the Rebbe Rashab, about the Yechidus that happened that day. The Rebbe Maharash, after a long day, called in his son and told him the following, as the Frierdiker Rebbe reports. And he says, turning to the Rebbe Rashab, he says, today I had two Chassidim that visited me. One Chassid caused a great deal of nachas ruach. I was very, very proud of this one Chassid. Another Chassid, he said, caused atifet tsar, deep pain. And Rebbe Maharash goes on to illustrate what happened in these two Yechidisim. The first Chassid, says Rebbe Maharash, was a Chassid by the name of Rab Elia from the village of Abela, a little village near the city of Lubavitch. Rab Elia came into the Rebbe Maharash, and the Rebbe Maharash asked him, Rab Elia, was herzich bei dir? How's everything by you? To which Rab Elia responded, and he said, Baruch Hashem, Rebbe. Then he asked him, was herzich in dein Esek? How is your business going? He said, Rebbe, Baruch Hashem, Ober. And here comes the moment. Rab Elia Abela turned to the Rebbe Maharash and said, Rebbe, ich hab groß Zar von Yosefen. I'm so pained by a Yid in our community by the name of Yosef, was gefindt sich bei uns in Yishuv, and he has nebach no Hatzolah. Mutschert sich in Parnasse. And we tried to help him. We bought him a horse and a wagon, and the horse died. And then his merchandise was stolen. Nebach, every tzara you could think of is happening to this Rabbi Yosef. And he said, Rebbe, he turned to him, get him a bracha. He turned from the Oymek HaLev, he said, Rebbe, please give this Yid in our town a bracha. The Rebbe Marash said, you can help him. The mere fact that you feel his pain, that you're speaking about him with such love is already a Yeshua. And then he said, I want to be your shutif. The Rebbe Marash said, seeing how you're looking at another Yid, I want to be your shutif. And he took out a coin from his desk and he gave it to Rabbi Ella and he said, we are now shutfim. And he gave him a bracha and he said, what you're doing is amazing, how you're caring for another Yid. He will be gebenched, you will be gebenched. That's story number one. Chassid number one who caused enormous nachas ruach. Chassid number two walks into Reb Marash's room. He was a very distinguished chassid. He was a lamden, a chassidish yid. His name was Rab Eli of the city of Polotsk. He was an author of Sforim, a scholar, a very prominent Jew in his community. The Rebbe Marash turned to him and said, "Was hält sich bei dir in Stadt? How is everything?" He said, "Baruch Hashem, we have shiurim, chassidim, daven ba'ariches." And Baruch Hashem, the Kehillah is doing very well. The Rebbe Marash says, "Und was ist mit Midos? How are people living among each other? How is the behavior Midos ben Adam lachaveiroi?" So this chassid turned to Rebbe Marash and said, Midos, wie gvirische Jungeleit. You can interpret it any way you want. Not a very favorable response. People are not necessarily there for each other. I'm embellishing. And the Rebbe Marash was very upset. And he said, this is a problem. This is a serious problem. It's nice to hear about the shiurim. It's nice to hear about so many things going on with chassidim davening ba'ariches. But if they're not there for each other, this is a real serious issue. Go back, make a gemach. Start moisdis to be there for each other. Teach them how to be selfless, to care for one another. And then he said, when you come back next time, at the kommst zurück dem zweiten Mal, sollst mir bringen a bessere Gruß. Please bring a better report. And then the Rebbe Marash turns to his son, the Rebbe Rashab, and he says, Wenn ich gewollt noch geben mein Nefesh Halekis, if I would give in to my Nefesh Halekis, wollte ich Rab Eli Abeller, the first chassid, wollte ich ihm ausgekuscht. I would have embraced him and kissed him, the nachas that he gave me. Rabbi say, this sikha of the Friedrich Rebbe in Tafshin Hey is what comes to mind when we're sitting in Fabrenga by Dr. Feldman. And the Vahacha Yitna Liboy. Imagine the life that he led, but more important to us today, the life that he's teaching and inspiring us to lead. The ultimate Vahacha Yitna Liboy. To be there for each other. Vahacha Yitna Liboy until we're Zoiche Bekarev to be reunited with Dr. Feldman and Chassidim together with the Rebbe B'Roshenu B'Karev B'Meheira V'Yameinu Mamish.
Thank you very much. Just want to mention that just a little while before my Shver passed away, we heard from Shamshi Yunik that he remembered this when the Rebbe wasn't doing well and needed treatment on his feet, that the Rebbe Goner would call my Shver. He'd be in the office with many patients, and he would tell him, the Rebbe is ready for you now. He would drop everything, run to the Rebbe. Sometimes you had to wait 10 minutes, 15 minutes, wouldn't say a word. Sometimes another 10 minutes, 15 minutes, didn't say a word. And then treat the Rebbe, go back to his patients, and all of his patients knew that he was going to treat the Rebbe. And for him, it was no shaila. The Rebbe needs him, the Rebbe to need him. He ran, and he was there in a moment, in a second. We're going to conclude Mishnayos. Baruch Hashem, my son Menachem Mendel and Levi Feldman called every person, and they all concluded the Mishnayos. Thank you very much for the calls, and thank you everybody for learning the Mishnayos. My dear brother-in-law, David, is going to conclude the Mishnayos, followed by Kaddish from Hanan and David. But I just want to say, I know Refraim just told us a lot of ideas of Chayit and Liboy. I think if we could think of a Chayit and Liboy, my Shver, as everybody said, to take it to heart, to continue in his ways, is Pashat Chavek Legin Fanochayid. Put yourself on the side when it comes to another Yid. How many times does somebody call us, I'm busy, I have things to do, I have things to go to, somebody calls you. Take this lesson from my dear Shver Dr. Feldman, and a Yid needs you, no questions asked. Obviously, so like you said the story before, just go and do it. And from my dear Shviger, Shoshana Bas Menachem Mendel, we could learn Hachnasas Urchim. The truth is that in Crown Heights, it's preaching to the choir. Everybody has Hachnasas Urchim, has people staying there, sleeping there, eating by you. My Shviger, the house was known, it was like a public house. Basically, somebody needed a l'chaim, a bar mitzvah, a wedding, a bris, a shalom zachar, whatever they needed. Her house was not her house. Her house was for the community. So just to continue the achnasas archim that she did, and all the years, we should continue to open our homes even more than we did before, and this will be v'chayit nalibay. I want to mention a lot of people after, a lot of families after somebody passed away, that they take an initiative, an idea that they're going to do. We, the family, did not actually take upon ourselves any specific individual thing to do. We might, but not right now. What I would suggest is that anybody does any, as you all do, tzedakah, give tzedakah to any mesid, Chabad house, whatever it is, and when you give this tzedakah, say that you're giving it in honor of Moshe and Miriam, that the neshama should have an aliyah. I'm now going to ask David to come up and do the Mishnayos. On behalf of the Feldman family, thank you very much for coming and for honoring our dear Shver and Shviger.
Amir Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Asli HaKadosh Baruch Hu lahanchi l'chol tzadik v'tzadik, shloish meis v'asara olamas. Ultimately, Hashem will grant through inheritance 310 worlds to every tzaddik. Shneimar, as it says in Mishlei, lahanchil oyav yesh. I will cause those that love me to inherit yesh. Yesh is gematria 310, which alludes to the 310 worlds that we just mentioned. V'yitzersei male, and I will fill their treasuries. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, V'yimatz HaKadosh Baruch Hu kli machzik bracha li Yisrael. The only kli that Hashem found that could hold brachas for Yisrael, Ela Shalom, is peace. Shenemar, as it says in Tilim, Hashem ois la'ama yitain, Hashem wants to give strength to the Yidden, Hashem yavarech es ha'mei v'shalom. Therefore, Hashem first benches us with shalom so that we can have all the other brachas.
Yiskadav, Yiskadash, Meraba, Baum, die Vakus, we haben Machus, we ask Machmekane, we got Mashiach, we Chayechen, we make, and Chayde God basis so, Bagolov is Makari, the Amen. Yesh Meraba, Varachlom, Maya, Spark, we Shabach, we Spark, we Shemon, we Snase, we Sadar, we Saleh, we Salosh, we Kuchabricho, Leilam kom Chasa, we Shiras, we Chasa, we Nachamasa, Damir Balma, we Amen. Ayisa, Barabana, Tamidim, Vakol, Tamide, Samidehim, Vakomandas, Kimbaraisa, Diva, Asadim, Asabasar, Yehela, Harin, Chainshlam, Rabachin, Chisa, Berachim, Chain, Arichin, Zain, Rebicha, Ovin Kadamikadam, Vunishmaya, Vimo, Amen. Yehishlam, Rabin, Mishmayim, Chaim, Tevim, Lenim, Vakayisa, Vimo, Amen. Aisa Shalom, Rema, Yasa, Shalom, Lenim, Vakayisa, Vimo, Amen.
Everybody's welcome to have something to drink, something to eat. And in Mir Hashem, Bekarev Mamish, we should go out of this galus together with the Rebbe B'Reshenu, V'kitzav Rana Shechni Ofra, V'hem B'Techam. Thank you very much for coming. Good night.